Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to our exploration of Muhammad Ali Amir-Moezzi's groundbreaking work, The Divine Guide in Early Shia Islam, that challenges many commonly held views about Shiaism's intellectual development. Today we continue our journey through chapter 1, focusing on a critical turning point in Shiite intellectual history, the tension between esotericism and rationalization. In our previous episodes, we examined the foundational aspects of early Shiaism, and today we are going to explore a critical historical tension within the Imamite community, a fundamental divide that has shaped Shiite theology for centuries. The divide between esoteric traditionalism and theological rationalization to understand divine truths. And by the term traditionalism, we're referring to the exclusive reliance and acceptance of revelation, the hadith or the akhbar. What we'll discover is that the division of the Shias into those who embraced dialectical reasoning, also known as Kalam, and those who rejected it, didn't actually emerge later in the 17th century. Rather, this tension was present from the very beginning, as far back as the 8th and 9th centuries, in the circle of the sixth Imam, Imam Jafar al-Sadiq alayhi salam, himself. Let's begin by identifying some of the earliest theologians who emerged from the circle of Imam Jafar al-Sadiq. Historical sources identify several of his disciples as the very first mutakallimun. Mutakallimun means those who engage in kalam or dialectical theology. These figures included Zurara ibn Ayan, Hisham ibn Salim, Muhammad ibn al-Noman, and Hisham ibn al-Hakam, all of whom were the companions of Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, meaning that they lived approximately in the 8th century. And what's interesting about these early theologians is that we only have fragments of their work, often preserved through the writings of their opponents. Their theological language was still developing, and they were pioneers exploring this new conceptual territory. Yet, despite this formative stage, they were already becoming skilled in theological debates and contributed significantly to the emerging science of Kalam. Now, this historical reality has led some researchers to jump to what Amir-Moezzi considers an erroneous conclusion, that the Imams themselves, particularly the fifth and the sixth Imams, were theologians who actively encouraged the study and practice of Kalam. This is where Amir-Moezzi's analysis becomes particularly illuminating. He argues that the historical evidence shows the Imams were far from being in agreement with all the intellectual ideas and methods of their theologian disciples. In fact, these early Shiite theologians didn't profess a unified doctrine that aligned with the Imam's teachings. They often conflicted with each other and sometimes, though rarely, even openly challenged and opposed their spiritual guides, meaning the Imams. So, what was the actual position of the Imams regarding Kalam, dialectical theology? Well, what appears to have happened is that the Imams occasionally tolerated the use of Kalam for tactical reasons. They recognized its utility in public debates against opponents and in maintaining unity within the Imamite community, which was threatened by violent differences of opinion and quarrels over matters of theology. And as you know, the Imams always used wisdom, or we can say some level of diplomacy, to prevent the community and their core teachings from being wiped out completely. But what truly characterized the Imam's teachings was a position that was clearly hostile to Kalam and hostile to the use of dialectical and logical reasoning, whether in the form of qiyas, analogical reasoning, rai, personal opinion, or ijtihad, independent reasoning, in all matters related to religion. The earliest compilations of our hadith provide abundant evidence for this anti-rationalist position. Let's see some of these powerful traditions that demonstrate the Imam's skepticism towards dialectical reasoning. One tradition states the partisans of analogical reasoning were in search of divine knowledge, but their method resulted only in distracting them from the truth. God's religion cannot be acquired by analogical reasoning. Another tradition relates a conversation between the disciples and the seventh Imam, Imam Musa al-Kazim alayhi salam. A disciple named Sama ibn Mehran explained, "During our meetings, we occasionally talk about something upon which, thanks to your blessed presence, we have a written document. But we also occasionally come upon something about which we have no idea. In this event, we compare it to the most similar case about which we have information using analogical reasoning." And what was the Imam's response? Imam's response was decisive. He said, "You have nothing to do with analogical reasoning. Those who came before you perished because of such reasoning. When it comes to a case about which you have received information, that means the knowledge or the ilm from us, speak about it. Otherwise, keep silent." Now consider the implications of this statement. The Imam is effectively saying that in religious matters, one should only speak on topics for which there is direct transmission from the Imams themselves. In the absence of such transmission, silence is the appropriate response, not rational speculation or analogical reasoning. Another telling tradition recounts someone asking the sixth Imam, Imam Jafar al-Sadiq alayhi salam, "What is your personal idea on such a subject?" And the Imam replied, "Silence. All that we, the Imams, say comes from the Prophet. We have no personal ideas." Other traditions from the Imams include statements like, "He who knows and venerates God abstains from speaking about him. Speak of God's creation and not of God himself. Using Kalam in what pertains to God only increases confusion." And perhaps most strikingly, perdition is the lot of the partisans of Kalam, and salvation is that of the submissive. The submissive are the nobles of this community. Now, these teachings paint a clear picture. The Imams consistently warn against applying human reasoning to religion and divine matters. They reject the notion of independent reasoning, advocating instead for a direct transmission of knowledge from the Prophet through the Imams. One of the most significant consequences of the Imam's rejection of Kalam was the emergence and dominance of what became known as the Qummi School, a traditionalist approach centered in the city of Qum in Iran. And like we mentioned earlier, by traditionalist we mean based purely on traditions or hadith or akhbar. This school emphasized direct transmission of the Imam's teachings and rejected theological speculation. What's crucial to understand is that this traditionist dominance wasn't a later development. It existed during the lifetime of the Imams themselves and continued through both the minor occultation and into the major occultation, which began in 329 Hijri. And during this relatively short period, the traditionist approach appears to have been nearly absolute. And those who attempted to chart a middle path between traditionalism and rationalism, or who advocated for a more rationalist approach, were marginal figures and distinctly in the minority, as were the outright rationalists. So this period was a relatively short period that was strong until the major occultation of the Imam. The critical turning point in Imamite intellectual history came in the second half of the 4th century Hijri. The rationalist tendency of theologians and jurists from what became known as the Baghdadi School started to gain prominence, largely thanks to the influential work of Shaykh al-Mufid and his disciples. And this Baghdadi school gradually overshadowed the traditionalist Qummi school. This marked a pivotal turning point in Imamite intellectual history. Mufid's approach represented a significant departure from the earlier traditionalist methodology. His approach embraced rational theological discourse in a way that would have been viewed with suspicion by the early Imams and their closest disciples. The transition from traditionalism to rationalism eventually gave the dominant position to the rationalists, a dominance that continues to this day in mainstream Twelver Shi'ism. Now we come to what Amir-Moezzi identifies as the crucial question, the most important question that scholars have largely failed to ask. What was the effect of this transition from traditionalism to rationalism on the fundamental doctrines of Imamism? This is not merely an academic question about historical development. It cuts to the heart of Shiite identity and theology. What happens when a religious tradition originally founded on esoteric knowledge, directly transmitted from divinely guided Imams, becomes rationalized through human dialectical methods? To frame this question another way, what was the Imamite worldview before this change, and what did it become afterward? What spiritual dimensions, what esoteric understandings, what mystical insights were potentially lost or transformed when the tradition shifted from direct transmission to rational interpretation? These questions are profound, and they force us to reconsider the entire trajectory of Imamite theology. They suggest that the original teachings of the Imams may have been significantly different from what later became the mainstream understanding of Twelver Shi'ism. The evidence presented by Amir-Moezzi points to an inescapable conclusion. The earliest form of Imamism was profoundly esoteric in its outlook. The Imam's rejection of Kalam wasn't simply a methodological preference. It reflected a fundamentally different understanding of religious knowledge. This means that the later triumph of rationalism within Twelver Shi'ism, while intellectually sophisticated and institutionally successful, may represent a departure from the original vision of the Imams themselves. In the early Imamite worldview, true knowledge of divine matters wasn't something that could be reached through logical deduction or dialectical reasoning. Rather, it was transmitted directly from the Prophet to the Imams, and from the Imams to their closest disciples. To put it bluntly, the rationalist Kalam theology that came to dominate Twelver Shi'ism from the 10th century onward may have moved away from the esoteric heart of the Imam's original teachings. The very theological methods that were later embraced by mainstream Shi'ism, meaning that dialectical reasoning, analogical deduction, rational argumentation, were explicitly warned against in numerous traditions from the Imams. What emerges from Amir-Moezzi's analysis is a picture of early Imamism as fundamentally esoteric. The Imams weren't simply religious scholars applying rational methods to scriptural interpretation. They were divinely guided repositories of sacred knowledge, transmitting truths that transcended human reasoning. Their approach wasn't anti-intellectual. Far from it. Rather, they recognized the limitations of human intellect when confronting divine mysteries. They understood that certain truths could only be received through direct transmission from those who are divinely appointed to preserve and communicate them. This is why the Imams consistently warned against personal opinion, rai, and analogical reasoning, qiyas. Not because they opposed thinking itself, but because they understood that divine truths couldn't be derived through human cognitive processes alone. Some knowledge could only be received, not deduced. The gradual dominance of rationalism within Twelver Shi'ism from the 10th century onward, therefore, represents a profound shift in the community's approach to religious knowledge. It was a move from a primarily receptive model of knowledge, where truth is received from the Imam, towards an interpretive model where truth is derived through rational methods. This shift had enormous implications for how Shiites understood the role of the Imam, the nature of religious authority, and the path to spiritual knowledge. It fundamentally altered the epistemological foundations of the tradition. The triumph of the Baghdadi school of rational theology, while intellectually fertile and institutionally successful, may have obscured some of the esoteric dimensions of early Imamism. The very approaches warned against by the Imams became the dominant methodologies of mainstream Shiite scholarship. As we conclude this episode, I want to emphasize the contemporary relevance of this historical analysis. By challenging the conventional narrative of Imamite intellectual development, we need to reconsider our understanding of Shi'ism's earliest period and its relationship to later developments. The tension between esotericism and rationalization, between direct transmission and dialectical reasoning, was not a later innovation, or was present from the very beginning. And while the rationalist approach eventually gained dominance, the esoteric dimension of the Imam's teachings continues to exert a powerful influence on Shiite spirituality and thought. In our next episode, we'll continue exploring Amir-Moezzi's work, delving deeper into the specific doctrines and concepts that characterized early Imamite thought before its rationalization. We'll examine how these doctrines were gradually transformed through the application of Kalam and what was lost or preserved in this process. Until then, I encourage you to reflect on the implications of today's discussion. How might our understanding of Shiaism change if we take seriously the possibility that the earliest form was primarily esoteric rather than rationalistic? And what might this tell us about the nature of religious knowledge more broadly? Thank you for joining me on this intellectual journey. Until next time, Ma salam.